Alright guys, before we get started, I just wanted to mention that we are going to need stitch markers. These are essential. Make sure that you have them. If you don't have stitch markers, safety pins work really well. So to start, we are going to make a slip knot, place it on your hook, and tighten it up. Now chain 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're going to find the first chain that we made, so this one right here, and we're going to go underneath that top loop of our chain. Okay, we're going to yarn over and we're going to pull the strand through the stitch, and then we're also going to pull it through the loop on our hook. And that makes, if you stretch out your work, it makes a small chain circle. And that's what we're going to be working in for round 1. To start round 1, we are going to chain 2, 1, 2, and we're going to go into the chain circle. You guys might notice that there's a bit of a hole here, or a gap. That's where we worked a slip stitch into the chain. This is the chain, but below it, if you stretch out your work, you'll see that bigger gap there, the bottom, that's our chain circle. So you want to make your stitches in there. So we're going to yarn over and we're going to insert our hook into the circle, yarn over and draw up a loop. So we have 3 loops on our hook. We're going to yarn over and pull through all 3 loops. And that makes a half double crochet. And we're going to do that once more. So yarn over, insert your hook into the circle, yarn over, draw up a loop, yarn over and pull through all 3 loops. So that is what we are going to call a cluster. A cluster is made up of 2 half double crochets. And we're going to chain 1. Now we're going to make another cluster into this chain circle. So remember guys, cluster is 2 half double crochets. And then we're going to chain 1. And we're going to do this 2 more times. So make your next cluster. Chain 1. And make your 4th cluster, chain 1. So at this point we have a total of 4 clusters and 4 chain 1 spaces. To end the round, we are going to make a slip stitch. So right here, if you look at the side of your work, this is your chain 2. 1, 2. This doesn't count as a stitch throughout the entire pattern. So the first stitch of the round is actually this first half double crochet that we made. So it's right here. We're going to insert our hook under both loops, and we're going to yarn over, pull through the stitch and the loop on your hook, and that makes a slip stitch. Now, this is important. We're going to pull up on the loop on our hook, remove your hook, and pick up your stitch marker. And we are going to put it into the loop, and we've now marked it. Now, it's not going anywhere. Okay, the last thing that we can do is we have this tail here. This is part of our chain circle, so we can tug on it, and that kind of closes up that hole really nicely. And now we are just going to turn our work. So we're literally just going to flip it over so that we're looking at the back side of our square. Okay guys, it's time for round 2, so grab your next color, color B, and you're going to loop it over your finger. Now, this stitch marker, it marks one of our corner stitches, so we're basically just going to find any other corner chain 1 space. I'm looking at this one right here. If you separate your work a little bit, if you wiggle it around, you'll be able to see these little holes here, which are our chain 1 spaces. So just insert your hook into any of those spaces, not the one marked with your stitch marker. We're going to pick up the new color and we're going to pull it through that space. And we're going to chain 2. All right, we've now fastened on, so we are going to start round 2. So to start round 2, we're going to go into that chain 1 space again, and we're going to make a cluster stitch. All right, now we're gonna skip over this cluster here, and we're gonna go into the next chain 1 space. So again, guys, if you separate your work a little bit, you should be able to see it, this hole here. We're gonna go in and we're gonna make 1 cluster stitch, chain 1, and then we're also gonna make a second cluster stitch all into that same chain 1 space. And this becomes our new corner. We have arrived. You might not yet, and that's okay. If you haven't arrived at your stitch marker yet, you're just going to go into your next corner and you're going to repeat what we just did in this corner. So a cluster, chain 1, cluster, all into that same chain 1 space. Okay, now this is key. This is a key part for how we're going to change color and kind of set it up for future rounds. It can be a little bit tricky when you first get going, but it gets a lot easier as we go along. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to find our working yarn. This is the really long strand. And we're just going to make sure that it's in front of our granny square, which it is. It's right here. And we're also going to bring our loop, we're also going to bring it to the front of the granny square as well. Okay, so try your best to kind of hold them in place. Gonna push them to the left so that we have access to our chain 1 space. So this is our cluster, this is the beginning chain 2 that we made, and this is our chain 1 space. So with these things pushed to the left, we're going to go into that chain 1 space and we're going to make our first cluster, and then we're going to chain 1. Okay guys, now it's time to do the rest of our corner. So now grab your loop and grab your working yarn, and we're going to move them to the right. So just kind of push them out of the way. And now again, guys, we still have access to that chain 1 space. It's that same space that we made our first cluster into. Okay, now going into that space, we're going to make our second cluster, and that completes our corner. So the reason that we did this, do you guys see this strand here and the loop? They're almost trapped in between these 2 clusters of our corner, which is exactly what we want, because I'll show you what happens with round 3, but you're going to see that it's going to be easily accessible now for round 3, and we're going to be able to seamlessly change color. It's really cool. Okay, then going into the next corner chain 1 space, we are going to make a cluster, chain 1, followed by a second cluster. Okay, so we have finished 3 corners and we have our first corner still left. So we only have half of our corner at this point. We only have 1 cluster. So going into that first chain 1 space, we're going to make a cluster, chain 1, and that completes our first corner. So find your first half double crochet that you made. So right here, we're going to go under both loops and make a slip stitch. So yarn over, pull through the stitch and the loop on your hook, and now pull up on the loop on our hook, and we're going to mark it with our stitch marker. All right, so we have just finished round 2, and now it's time to turn our work and start round 3. So to do that, we're just going to flip our work. And now we are looking at the back side of round 2. Okay guys, we are going to find the corner with color A's stitch marker, so this one right here, and we're going to remove the stitch marker from the loop. Okay, notice that your yarn is on the back side of your granny square, which is exactly what we want. So we've removed our stitch marker. We're going to insert our hook into that corner chain 1 space, and we're going to place the loop on our hook, and we're just going to tighten it up. All right, now pull that loop and your hook through the space. So now the loop is at the front of our granny square, and we're going to chain 2. Now this can make things a little tight here, but just try your best to kind of feel for it. We're going to go under this chain 1 space, and we're going to make our first cluster to start the round. Now, between these 2 clusters, we didn't make any chain 1 spaces, but you'll notice that there is a noticeable gap. So I want you guys to go in between these 2 clusters, going underneath, that stitch, and we're going to make a cluster. Now, going into the next corner chain 1 space, we're going to make our corner, so that's 1 cluster, chain 1, followed by a second cluster. Okay, and now we see these 2 clusters here. There's no chain 1 space between them, but there is a space. So we're going to insert our hook, and we're going to make our next cluster. And now we see that there's color B here. We have our loop and we have our working yarn. So just like before guys, we are going to make sure that our working yarn and our loop is kind of at the front of our granny square, and we're just going to bring it over to the left so that we can see our corner chain 1 space. So working into our corner chain 1 space, we're going to make our first cluster, chain 1, and then we're going to move the loop and our working strand, we're going to move it to the right so we can go on the other side of it, and we're going to go into that same space, and we're going to make our second cluster. And that traps color B between our corner clusters. Now going into the gap or the space between our next clusters, we're going to make a cluster. Going into our corner chain 1 space, we're going to make a cluster, chain 1, followed by a second cluster. Between these 2 clusters here, we're going to go into that gap and we're going to make our next cluster. Okay, we've arrived back at our first chain 1 space of the round. So our corner is only half done. So we're going to insert our hook into that space and we're going to make a cluster, chain 1 to complete our corner. Now we're going to find our first half double crochet of the round, so right here, and we're going to insert our hook under both loops and we're going to make a slip stitch. Now pull up on the loop on your hook and we're going to mark it with our stitch marker. And there we go. This is what round 3 is looking like. So to start round 4, we're going to turn our work, so flip it over so you're looking at the back side of round 3. Okay guys, round 4 is going to be our pattern repeat. So we're basically going to be repeating round 4 for the rest of our pot holder while alternating between, color A and color B. So just like in round 3, we're going to find our next color, which is color B, where we had our stitch marker, and we're going to remove it. Now we're going to insert our hook into that chain 1 space, and we're going to place the loop on our hook and then tighten it up. Pull our hook and our loop through so that it's now at the front of our work, and we're going to chain 2. Now going into the corner chain 1 space, we're going to make our first cluster. And we're going to make a cluster into each space or gap between our clusters. So see how we have one here between these 2 clusters, and then we also have another gap here between these 2 clusters. So make a cluster into each space. And then when we get to our corner chain 1 space, we are going to make a cluster, chain 1, followed by a second cluster. And we're going to repeat this around. So in every gap or space between our clusters, we're going to make a new cluster. And then when we get to this corner with color A, we're going to make sure that that the loop and our strand is at the front of our granny square. And we're going to kind of push it off to the side and locate our chain 1 space. So going into that space, we're going to make our first cluster, chain 1, then push it over to the right so that we can go on the other side of it, and we're going to make our second cluster. And again guys, that just traps it in place so that we can access it next round. Okay guys, we're at the end of the round and we've arrived back at our first corner. So going into that corner chain 1 space, we're going to make a cluster, chain 1 to complete our corner. We're going to find our first half double crochet, go into it under both loops, and make a slip stitch. Now pull up on the loop on your hook, and you're going to mark it with your stitch marker. And there we go. This is what round 4 should look like. To start round 5, just flip your work so that we're looking at the back side of round 4.